All right, welcome. Today we're diving into a guide to attraction that's, well, it's pretty fascinating and, let's be honest, kind of provocative. We're going to deconstruct the art of seduction, not as some big mystery, but as a learnable skill, almost like a psychological blueprint that you can build for yourself. So, right from the get-go, the source material, A Guide from Alina Chamberlain, sets the stage with this quote. The core idea is that seduction isn't some mystical, magical thing. Note, it's presented as a system, a very deliberate use of psychological triggers that are designed to create a really powerful, lasting attraction.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do in this explainer. We're just going to neutrally break down the key concepts from Chamberlain's guide. We'll be looking at the three main pillars of this whole structure. First, mastering the psychological game, then building a sensory blueprint, and finally, designing a path toward long-term commitment.
Let's start with pillar number 1, the psych game. According to this guide, this is where it all begins. It's about learning how to use language and how to frame your mindset to influence a man's perception and ultimately create a state of near obsession.
Okay, so what's really interesting here is how it compares two totally different ways of talking. On the left, you've got what the guide calls the trap of devaluation. You know, when you put yourself down to kind of fish for a compliment. The book argues this actually backfires and plants seeds of doubt. But then on the right, you have affirmative mirroring. This is where you state your own beauty as if it's just a fact. According to the guide, this approach invites him to simply be a spectator to a confidence that's already there, which is presented as way, way more powerful.
And then, things get, well, a lot more intense with a technique called peak state commands. The theory here is that during the absolute height of physical intimacy, the brain is in a super suggestible state. So the guide suggests using specific verbal commands right at that moment to, as the quote says, literally program his subconscious to connect his ultimate pleasure directly with you.
And check this out. This is one of the guide's most detailed tactics, especially for long-distance stuff, the short circuit. The steps are all designed to build up this incredible arousal, and then, right at the peak, you suddenly disconnect. The idea is that this creates a kind of psychological vacuum, an unfinished loop that forces his mind to just obsessively replay the moment and fantasize about how it ends. It basically puts you in control of his thoughts.
Okay, so now we move on to our second pillar, the sensory blueprint. Here, we're shifting gears from the purely psychological to something way more primal. This is all about using scent, taste, and touch to forge these really powerful, lasting neurological anchors in his brain.
The guide puts a huge emphasis on scent, calling it the alchemy of aroma. It points out that our sense of smell is basically a direct hotline to the part of the brain that handles emotion, memory, and arousal. What that means is that scent can totally bypass the logical mind and trigger these really powerful, gut-level responses.
So, how do you actually do this, according to the guide? It's all about creating a scent signature. This means consistently wearing a specific perfume during intimate moments to create that association. It also suggests using certain aphrodisiac oils and this is the really strategic part, leaving a scented souvenir. You know, your fragrance on his pillow or in his car, just to keep that sensory memory fired up even when you're not around.
And it's not just about smell. The sensory blueprint also includes taste, using what the guide calls gastronomic anchoring. The idea is pretty simple. Master his absolute favorite meal, make it perfectly. By doing that, you're tying that huge dopamine hit he gets from the perfect food directly to being with you. Another powerful, positive memory anchor.
And finally, for touch, we get to what the source calls the master's kiss. And this is not just any kiss. It's described as a technically precise performance, a strategic tool that's designed to create such a deep state of arousal that it acts like a hook, basically making him biologically wired to want to see you again.
And when they say technical, they are not kidding. Just look at these steps. It starts with priming the senses. Then there's a specific path for your hands called a somatic map, moving with purpose from his head down his back. Step 3 describes placing your fingers at the so-called million-dollar spot, which is an external pressure point near the prostate. This gets combined with sensory mirroring, where you sync up the movements of your tongue and your fingers. And just like the short circuit, it ends with a Cinderella exit, stopping suddenly at peak intensity to create that powerful open loop that leaves him wanting so much more.
Okay, so you've set the psychological hooks. You've built the sensory anchors. What's next? Well, that brings us to the final pillar, the architecture of commitment. This is where all those previous techniques come together into a long-term strategy, one that's designed to steer a relationship from that very first date all the way to a lifelong partnership.
And the path is laid out in 4 very clear stages.
It starts with the fateful encounter, where the whole goal is to build mystery and anticipation. Then it moves into creating an intimate anchor to really solidify the connection. After that comes the exclusive bond stage, and it all culminates in the lifelong union, where the focus shifts to keeping that attraction alive for the long haul.
So this entire journey is guided by a few core principles. You've got the scarcity principle, always leave them wanting more. You use future pacing, which is all about painting a picture of your future together during those high emotion moments. But crucially, the guide really stresses having a sovereignty of time, having your own amazing, fulfilling life separate from him, and saving certain wife's duties only for marriage, which is framed as a way to keep the incentive for commitment high.
And all of this brings us to the grand finale of the guide, what it calls the final sovereign code. After all these techniques and all these strategies, this section comes back to what it claims is the real foundation of all attraction.
And really, this is the ultimate takeaway. The source argues that all of these tools, the psych games, the sensory anchors, they're all secondary. The number one most powerful force is a woman's own genuine fulfillment. The idea is that when you are totally enchanted with your own life, that energy is what becomes truly magnetic.
So the final guiding principle laid out in this work is pretty simple. Put your own joy first. The claim is that when you are truly lit up by your own life, your own passions, your own pleasure, you just become an irresistible force of nature. And that is the real source of any lasting power when it comes to attraction. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative final question, right? After going through all these highly strategic techniques, is this a blueprint for manipulation? Or is it actually a radical guide to self-love, arguing that the ultimate power just comes from being so fulfilled in yourself that you become magnetic? That's something to think about.
You can find the electronic version of book She Who Awakens by Alina Chamberlain at wishforlove.org.